my 68th Thanksgiving, I set the table for 11 people. I bought a 22-pound turkey, made my late wife's cornbread stuffing from scratch, and drove 40 minutes to get the good pie from that bakery in Clarksburg my son-in-law once said he loved. I ironed the tablecloth, I put out the good china, the set we only used for holidays. I even set up the folding table in the living room so the grandkids would have their own space. Nobody showed up. Not my daughter, not her husband, not my 2 grandchildren who I hadn't seen in 4 months, not my son, who lived 20 minutes away and had said, quote, "I'll try to make it, Dad." I stood in my kitchen at 2 in the afternoon with a fully cooked Thanksgiving dinner, and silence so loud it had a sound. That was the day everything changed, not because they didn't come, but because of what I found out later that night, and what I decided to do about it. My name isn't important. What I'm about to tell you is, I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years working in commercial real estate, not the glamorous kind, not the Manhattan penthouses, just industrial properties and strip malls in central Ohio. It wasn't exciting work, but it was honest work and it paid well. My wife Lorraine and I raised 2 kids in a 4-bedroom house in Worthington. We took vacations to the Outer Banks every summer. We drove used cars until the wheels fell off. We saved. We were careful. Lorraine died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to gone. I don't talk about it much because when I start I can't stop. And this story isn't about her. But she matters to it, because losing her is what made me vulnerable in ways I didn't even recognize at the time. When Lorraine died, I had the house paid off, a solid retirement account, and what I thought was a close family. My daughter, Reese, 34, married to a guy named Dwight, lived in Columbus about 40 minutes away. My son, Perry, 31, single at the time, lived even closer. I thought at least I have them. At least I'm not truly alone. Within 6 months of Lorraine's funeral, the requests started. The first one was from Reese. She called on a Sunday evening, very casual, said she and Dwight were thinking about refinishing the basement to add a guest room and a home office for Dwight, who had just started working remotely. The contractor quote came in at $18,000. Could I help with some of it? I said yes. Of course I did. I was grieving, I wanted to feel useful, and honestly $18,000 felt manageable. I wrote the check. 3 months later, Reese called again. Dwight's car had been totaled in an accident. He was fine. She was quick to add, but they only got $11,000 from insurance and the car they wanted was $23,000. Could I cover the gap? I covered the gap. Perry had his own version of this. His was smaller per request but more frequent. $300 here for a car repair. $800 there when he got behind on rent. $1,400 for dental work, he said. Insurance wouldn't fully cover. He always paid me back in a way. He'd Venmo me $50 or $100 every few months with a note like, "Toward what I owe." And I'd tell him not to worry about it. I meant it. He was my kid. What I didn't see was the pattern. Because individually, each of these things felt like normal family stuff. Parents help their kids. That's what you do. That's what Lorraine and I had always said we'd do. We had saved specifically so we could help them if they needed it. The problem was, if they need it, had slowly and quietly become whenever they want it, without anyone saying out loud that anything had changed. By the time Thanksgiving came around, I had given Reese and Dwight somewhere in the range of $64,000 over 2.5 years. Perry had received somewhere around $22,000, though that number was harder to track because of how informal it had all been. I didn't know those numbers at the time. I knew I'd been generous. I didn't know I'd been that generous. In September, Reese called to ask about Thanksgiving. She wanted to host, she said. Could I help with the groceries? I said I'd just host it myself. I had the bigger house, the better kitchen, and frankly, I wanted something to do. Something to prepare for, something that would make the house feel like a home again, instead of just a place where I slept. She said, "Great, that works, we'll be there." She said that in September. She confirmed again in October when I asked if there was anything specific the grandkids wanted. She said she'd send me a list. She never did, but I bought things I thought they'd like anyway. A board game I saw at Target, a couple of books, some of that specific brand of fruit snacks my granddaughter had mentioned once in passing. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I texted the group chat, the one Lorraine had set up before she died that I'd never had the heart to rename, still called Family Hum D, and said I was looking forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Dinner around 2, come whenever. Reese replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Perry replied. That was it. Thursday morning, I got up at 6 and started the turkey. I made the cornbread the night before, let it sit overnight the way Lorraine always did. I had the green bean casserole, the sweet potatoes, the cranberry sauce, the real kind, not the canned stuff. I had a cheese board set up by noon. I had sparkling cider for the kids and a decent bottle of Pinot for the adults. At 1:30, I sent a text. Turkey's resting, should be ready by 2. Drive safe. No response. At 2:15, I called Reese. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. At 2:40, I called Perry. He answered on the 3rd ring, and there was noise in the background. Music, voices, the unmistakable sound of a crowd in a good mood. Hey, Dad, he said. He sounded surprised I called, which itself was strange. Hey, where are you? A pause. Oh, I thought Reese called you. We're actually at Dwight's brother's place in Cincinnati. Kind of a last-minute thing. Last minute, I said, today. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry. I should have texted. Are you okay? I stood in my kitchen. The turkey was on the counter. The table was set. The folding table in the living room had 4 plates on it for grandchildren who were 5 hours away. I'm fine, I said, because I didn't know what else to say. Have a good time. I hung up. I stood there for a moment. Then I went to the garage, got a big roll of aluminum foil, and started wrapping everything. I drove 4 containers of food to my neighbor, a widow named, well, it doesn't matter. She was grateful. She cried a little actually, and I said, please don't. It's just food. And she said that's not why she was crying. I understood. I came home. I heated up 1 small plate for myself. I ate standing at the kitchen counter because I couldn't bring myself to sit at that table. After I ate, I went to the living room and did something I hadn't done in years. I got on Facebook. I almost never use it. Lorraine used to manage it for both of us. But I remembered Perry had it, and I thought, I don't know what I thought. I just wanted to see something. I found Perry's page. The most recent post was from that afternoon, time-stamped at 1:47, while my turkey was resting, and I was sending cheerful texts about driving safe. It was a photo. Perry, Reese, Dwight, the grandkids, Dwight's brother's family, all gathered around a decorated table. Perry had written, grateful for these people, real family shows up for each other. 47 likes. I read it 3 times. Real family shows up for each other. I closed Facebook and sat very still for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what happened in the weeks after that, because it wasn't pretty and it wasn't simple. I didn't do anything dramatic right away. I cried some, which I hadn't done much since Lorraine's funeral. I felt stupid, which was worse than sad. I kept going over every request, every check, every I'll pay you back, Dad, and I felt like the biggest fool in Central Ohio. My brother-in-law, Martin, Lorraine's older brother, came to visit in December. He'd been on me to come stay with him and his wife in Asheville for a while, and I'd kept putting it off. He showed up instead. That's the kind of person Martin is. I told him everything. I showed him what I'd compiled. I'd spent 2 weeks going through bank records, checking account statements, old Venmo requests. The total, when I added it all up properly, $89,400 over 2 years and 8 months. Martin looked at the number for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, Earl, did any of this ever come back to you? Earl is me, Earl Whitfield, 68 years old, Central Ohio, retired, father of 2. The answer was no. Not a cent had ever come back to me. Not a birthday dinner they paid for. Not a holiday gift that felt like more than a token. Not once had Reese or Perry said, unprompted, Dad, we know you've been incredibly generous since Mom died and we want to do something for you. Not once. I thought about that. I thought about it a lot. Martin asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I didn't know yet. He said, whatever it is, I'm with you. And so is Christine, his wife. They've been married 40 years. They have 3 kids who call them every week. I'd watched that family for decades with something I can only describe as quiet envy. I called Reese in January. I asked if we could have lunch, just the two of us, no kids, no Dwight. She seemed surprised but said, sure. We met at a place she liked, a trendy spot in the short north with $15 salads. She ordered first without looking at the prices, which I noticed but didn't say anything about. I waited until we'd gotten our food. Then I put a piece of paper on the table. A simple one-page summary I'd made, nothing fancy, just dates and amounts. She looked at it. Her face didn't change right away. What is this? She said. It's a record of what I've given you and Dwight since your mother died. I thought we should talk about it. She picked it up. She read it. I watched her eyes go from curious to defensive in about 10 seconds. Dad, you gave us that money. We didn't ask you to keep a ledger. I know I gave it to you. I'm not asking for it back. I just want to talk about the pattern. The pattern, she repeated. Reese, I've given you and Dwight over $60,000 in less than 3 years. I've given Perry another 20-something, and I spent Thanksgiving alone because everyone went to Cincinnati without telling me until I called. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I knew you'd make that about money eventually. I said, I thought it was about family. She said the Instagram post Perry made wasn't meant to be hurtful. She said Dwight's brother had invited them last minute and they felt bad saying no because of some tension in his family that I wouldn't understand. She said I should have come to Cincinnati too, if I wanted to see them. She said she was sorry I had a hard Thanksgiving, but that she had a lot going on too, and she didn't need me adding guilt to it. I paid for lunch. I drove home. 2 weeks later, I called Perry. He was more sheepish about the Thanksgiving thing at least. He said he was sorry, genuinely, but it felt like a performance. When I brought up the money, the $22,000, he laughed a little and said, Dad, come on. I'm not good with numbers, you know that. He said he'd been meaning to pay me back and just hadn't gotten organized about it. He asked if I could spot him $400 for some car thing. Briefly, he'd pay it right back. I said no. He got quiet. Then he said, Are you serious? I said, yes. He said, okay, and we talked for a few more minutes about nothing and hung up. I could tell he was annoyed, but he covered it with pleasantness, which was somehow worse. In March, I called a financial advisor I'd been referred to, a woman named Patricia at a firm in Dublin, Ohio. I won't give you all the details of that conversation, but the overview is, I was in good shape, not rich, but solid. My retirement accounts were healthy. The house was worth significantly more than I'd paid for it. If I was careful, if I stopped hemorrhaging money in the form of family help, I would be genuinely fine for the rest of my life. She asked me about my estate planning. I said I hadn't updated anything since Lorraine died. She strongly suggested I do. I went to see an estate attorney the following month. His name was, well, it doesn't matter. He was a careful, quiet man who asked good questions and didn't editorialize. I told him what I wanted to do. He took notes. He said he'd have the documents ready within 3 weeks. I revised everything. I didn't cut my children out entirely. I want to be clear about that. But the allocations changed significantly. What had been a straightforward split now included provisions, trusts for the grandchildren, direct to them, bypassing their parents entirely, accessible when each of them turns 25. A meaningful portion to a hospice organization that had taken care of Lorraine at the end. An endowment at the community foundation I'd been involved with for years. Martin and Christine aren't in the will, but I've made separate arrangements that I think will surprise them in a good way someday. My children's shares still exist, but they're smaller now, and there are conditions. In June, Reese called. She and Dwight were looking at a bigger house. They'd found one they loved in a better school district, and the mortgage payment was going to be harder than they expected, and they were wondering if I could help with the down payment. They were looking at needing around $30,000. I said, I can't do that. Silence. What do you mean you can't? You've helped us before. I know. I've thought about that a lot, actually. Dad. Her voice went soft, which I recognized as a tactic even though I hated recognizing it that way. We really love this house. The kids would have their own rooms. Dwight's commute would be so much better. Reese, I love you. I love those kids, but no. Another silence. Then, is this about Thanksgiving? I said, it's about a lot of things. She said she'd have Dwight call me to explain the situation better. I said that wouldn't change my answer. She said she couldn't believe I was being like this. I said I understood, and I was sorry she felt that way. And I loved her. She hung up. Dwight did not call. Perry reached out in July, not for money this time, just to check in, which would have felt nice if I wasn't so aware by then of how little that had happened before I started saying no. We had a decent conversation. He asked how I was doing, and I said honestly. He asked what I'd been up to, and I told him. What I'd been up to was this. I had spent the spring and early summer doing things I'd stopped doing in the fog of grief, and then in the exhausting cycle of being needed by everyone except in the ways that actually mattered. I had joined a hiking group that met on Saturday mornings at a nature preserve about 12 miles from the house. I had started volunteering 2 mornings a week at a literacy nonprofit where I helped adults get their GED. I had driven down to Asheville twice to see Martin and Christine, and the second time I'd stayed for 10 days, and it was the most rested I'd felt in 3 years. I had also quietly and without announcement listed the house. The house was too big. It had been too big since Lorraine died, and I'd kept it out of some mixture of grief and habit, and the vague sense that I needed the space for when family came to visit, which they mostly didn't. Martin had connected me with a real estate agent in Asheville, who showed me 3 places. The second one was a smaller house on a corner lot in a quiet neighborhood with a porch that faced west and a garden that had been tended by the previous owner for 30 years. The price was right. The porch sold me. I made an offer in August. It was accepted. I sold the Worthington house in September for significantly more than I paid for it, because that's what markets do in 22 years. The profit was substantial. I structured some of it into the estate plan. The rest I did specific things with that felt right to me and that I don't feel the need to explain to anyone. I told Reese and Perry I was moving in a phone call, separately, each of them. I kept it brief. I told them when I was moving, gave them my new address, said I hoped they'd come visit sometime. Reese asked if I'd considered that this was going to make it much harder to be part of the grandkids' lives. I said I hoped that wasn't true. Perry asked what I was going to do in North Carolina, and I told him about the hiking group chapter I'd found. The volunteering, the porch, he said it sounded nice. He sounded like a stranger being polite, which in that moment was the saddest part of all of it. I moved in October. Martin and Christine drove up from Asheville to help. They brought a truck, sandwiches, and an annoying amount of cheerfulness that I was intensely grateful for. By evening we had the essentials in place, and we sat on the west-facing porch drinking beer and watching the sun go down over the mountains. And Martin said, Lorraine would like this place. I said I thought so too. Here's what I want to tell you about the months since then, because I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, is he lonely? Is he bitter? Did he ruin his relationships with his kids forever? The answer to the first question is sometimes, but not in the way I used to be. There's a version of lonely that comes from being surrounded by people who treat you like a resource. I lived in that kind of lonely for 2.5 years without naming it. The kind I have now. A quiet house, my own routines, a neighbor who sometimes brings me food because she's Italian and believes feeding people is a form of prayer. This kind is manageable. Some days it's more than manageable. Some days it's peaceful in a way I'd forgotten was possible. The answer to the second question is no, not really. Bitter requires expecting something different and being surprised. I'm past surprise. What I feel more often is a kind of clear-eyed sadness. I see it for what it was and I grieve it and I get on with the day. The third question is the hardest one. The honest answer is, I don't know. Reese and I talk about once a month. The calls are short and careful, like 2 people negotiating in a language neither is fully fluent in. She hasn't asked for money since June. I've started sending the grandchildren birthday cards with small checks, straight to them, their names on the envelope, nothing routed through their parents. My granddaughter wrote me a thank you note in her own handwriting. I have it on my refrigerator. Perry texts more than he calls. We have a running exchange about football that feels genuine. He came to visit in February, drove down himself, stayed 2 nights on the pull-out couch, and we hiked 4 miles on Saturday and made chili on Sunday. He didn't ask for anything. When he left, he hugged me longer than he usually does and said, I miss you, Dad. And I think he meant it. I think he's figuring some things out. Maybe they both are. I don't know. I can't know. What I know is this. I set a table for 11 people on Thanksgiving 2 years ago, and nobody came. And that night, when I found out why, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a vengeful one. Just a quiet, firm, overdue decision to stop arranging my life around people who weren't arranging theirs around me. I turned 69 last month. Martin and Christine drove up. A woman from my hiking group who has become a genuine friend brought a cake. My neighbor brought wine. 4 people sat on my west-facing porch and watched the sun go down over the mountains, and I thought about Lorraine. And I thought about the years I wasted, being afraid of inconveniencing everyone. And I thought about how strange and specific and hard-won this particular version of happiness is. The mountains don't care how old you are. The porch doesn't care if your children call. The sun goes down either way. Might as well be watching it from somewhere you chose, with people who showed up because they wanted to, not because they needed something from you. That's enough. After everything, it turns out that's more than enough. I think about that table a lot, the ironed tablecloth, the good china, the folding table I set up in the living room so the grandkids would have their own space. I was so careful about every detail, and the people I set it all up for didn't even pick up the phone to tell me they weren't coming. For a long time I blamed myself. That's what parents do. We run through every decision we ever made and ask, where did I go wrong? Did I give too much? Did I never say no early enough? Did I make it too easy for them to take and too comfortable for them never to give back? The answer to most of those questions honestly is yes, but blaming yourself and learning from it are two different things, and I spent too long doing the first before I got around to the second. What I've come to understand is that the way things ended up, the will, the move, the quiet rebuilding of my own life, wasn't punishment. It was consequence. There's a difference. Punishment is something you impose on someone. Consequence is just what happens when you stop interrupting the natural outcome of how people behave. I stopped writing checks. I stopped absorbing the cost of being treated as an afterthought. And the life I have now is the consequence of that. The good version. The one I didn't know was waiting. Reese and Perry are not bad people. I need to say that because I believe it. They made bad choices, sustained ones, and they never stopped to examine them because I never made examination necessary. That's on me as much as it's on them. A man who hands someone a blank check every time they ask doesn't get to be shocked when they stop asking nicely. I taught them, slowly and without meaning to, that I had no limits. It took me too long to prove otherwise. What changed me wasn't anger. It was clarity. There's a kind of thinking that only becomes possible when you stop being afraid of conflict, afraid of disappointing people, afraid of being alone. The night I sat at that kitchen counter with my single plate of Thanksgiving food and read Perry's post about real family showing up, something in me finally went quiet in the right way. Not numb, quiet. Like a decision had been made at a level below words. That kind of clarity is hard to come by and harder to hold on to. It requires something I spent most of my adult life undervaluing in myself. The willingness to look at a situation honestly, even when what you see reflects badly on decisions you made, and then to act on what you see instead of looking away. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like strength in the moment. It just feels like being very tired of your own excuses. Martin once told me, on that porch in Asheville with the sun going down, that the bravest thing a person can do is change the story they've been telling themselves about their own life. I didn't say anything back, but I've thought about it almost every day since. I'm 69 now. I have a porch that faces west. I have a neighbor who brings wine and a friend who brings cake and a brother-in-law who drives 4 hours just to make sure I'm not eating Thanksgiving dinner alone. Perry texted me last week about a football game. My granddaughter's thank you note is still on the refrigerator. It's not the life I planned, but it's mine. Actually mine. In a way it hadn't been for a very long time. That's the part nobody tells you about starting over at 68. It doesn't feel like starting over. It just feels like finally arriving,